A trend is now developing for OPEC, what oil ministers decided today about the cartel's output levels. Also, one U.S. state decides to cash in on more of its coal deposits. Who's leasing its resources and who is now up in arms about that decision. Plus, climate change is being blamed for an environmental effect in Alaska, an effect that is threatening both animals as well as the oil industry.
From the Energy News Center in Washington, D.C., this is the Energy Report with Susan McGinnis.
Good Tuesday morning. I'm Tyler Suiters in for Susan McGinnis. Thanks for joining us for this edition of the Energy Report on the 22nd day of December 2009. As expected, OPEC is leaving its output quotas unchanged this morning. They will remain at 24.845 million barrels a day. This is the fourth time this year OPEC has decided against revising that figure. Saudi oil minister Ali Al-Naimi called the current levels of close to $75 a barrel, in his words, perfect. But at the cartel meeting now underway in Angola this morning, ministers did share their concerns about lingering weakness in the world economy. And analysts say that high crude stockpiles could weaken the market once demand begins to fall in the spring. Taking a look at this morning's numbers, oil is now down 58 cents on the day. It's at $73.14 a barrel. Natural gas also trading down so far, losing ground 7 cents so far. It's at $5.60 per 1,000 cubic feet. In the meantime, Iraq says it now has an agreement with a group led by China's CNPC to develop a promising field in southern Iraq. This is the oil field we're talking about. The consortium will develop the 4.1 billion barrel Al-Fayah field, and it will eventually raise production from the current 3,100 barrels a day to 535,000 barrels a day, but this will take place over the course of 13 years. This 20-year agreement still needs to be approved by Iraq's cabinet before it becomes finalized. This morning, dozens of environmental groups are now urging EPA to proceed with its regulation of GHG emissions, that is, proceed without waiting for Congress to take action on its own. More than 100 groups joined climate scientist James Hansen in signing a petition filed this month by the Center for Biological Diversity and also by 350.org. The groups say EPA should not wait for a climate bill because they believe the Clean Air Act is the strongest existing tool for fighting emissions. So they want EPA to cap atmospheric CO2 at 350 parts per million, hence the 350 in 350.org. That is a level some scientists say is necessary to avoid the worst effects of climate change. EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson, for her part, has said she is against any types of that kind of limit, and she believes Congress should address the issue on its own. That is also what President Obama has said. Overseas this morning, China is now downplaying the comments from British Climate Minister Ed Miliband. Remember, we reported yesterday that he wrote an op-ed accusing China of hijacking the Copenhagen climate talks. He singled out the Chinese yesterday, saying in the Guardian newspaper the Chinese vetoed attempts to set hard carbon targets for 2050, and they scuttled any attempts to make the Copenhagen Accord legally binding. But Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Jing Yu says that those charges are baseless and politically motivated. Jing did not mention Miliband by name specifically, but she did say a British politician was behind a move to spark a dispute among developing nations. She went on to say many developed countries haven't honored their commitments to curb global warming, while China has made, in his words, arduous efforts. Chinese Prime Minister Wen Jiabao says China, quote, played an important and constructive role in crafting the Copenhagen Accord. Even though there is no real binding climate framework coming out of Copenhagen, Australia's Prime Minister is calling the meeting, in his term, a success. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd is arguing that world climate talks last week yielded 3 breakthroughs. First of all, he says they agreed to hold the Earth's temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Second, it holds that developing and developed countries agreed to at least cut their emissions to some degree. And finally, Rudd says they decided to develop an international monitoring system to verify emissions, a plus in his mind. And of course, the Copenhagen Accord is now getting tempered praise as well from environmental groups here in the U.S. Yesterday, I talked with WRI's Jonathan Lash and also Chris Flavin of Worldwatch about that agreement that is now in place. And Flavin tells me he thinks the deal among the U.S. and the major developing nations, that is Brazil, China, and India specifically, it does indeed pave the way for climate progress in the year to come.
The biggest reason to be optimistic about this whole problem is the substantial progress that's been made politically, both in the United States and China, as well as some of these other major countries. But I think it's particularly notable that where China and the U.S. are today is just remarkably different from where we each were a year ago. We have mobilized at the highest level, and there's a tremendous amount of business activity in both countries. And in fact, they're probably more important than this sort of political back and forth that we saw in Copenhagen is this real race to the top among businesses, both in China and India, who are going to be the leaders in the key renewable energy and energy efficiency industries. So I think that it's natural. I mean, these are the two key countries. There is an element of competitiveness. We are going to be at loggerheads from time to time, but I think that beneath the surface, there's actually a much more productive relationship that's beginning to take shape.
So what's the role of private industry, the motivation within each of these countries to succeed in a clean energy economy, and because of that, cut emissions voluntarily?
Well, that's the really strange thing here, because on the one hand, both countries are in a sense fighting to have less ambitious commitments themselves and to have the other side have a more ambitious commitment. That's the basic nature of these negotiations. But I think that there are key leaders in both the United States and China. Certainly President Obama is in that camp, and I think President Hu is as well, recognizing that we will actually be more successful economically if we're the first to develop some of these low-carbon technologies.
Chris Flavin, Jonathan Lash, and I also discuss what lies ahead for the international climate negotiations in the year to come and perhaps beyond. You can see our entire conversation on the Clean Skies Sunday Year in Review. That's coming up next weekend, the first Sunday of the new year. It airs at 9:30 a.m. on ABC here in the Washington, D.C. area. In Montana, that state's land board has now voted to lease 572 million tons of state-owned coal in southeastern Montana's Otter Creek Valley. This is a move that the state says could net $1 billion in royalties, money that Montana lawmakers say would go toward education. The board approved that lease over the objections of environmental groups. As you can imagine, many of them said that mining coal in that area would harm the valley and also the adjoining river basins. And one lawmaker in Montana, Mike Phillips, a state representative, argues that leasing the coal tracts would result in more than 1 billion tons of CO2 released into the atmosphere. He says that total is 30 times his state's annual output. Developers say any mine there won't go into operation for at least another 5 or 10 years. That's because Otter Creek has no major infrastructure and, of course, would require a huge investment to develop mines and rail links as well. Staying in that part of the country this morning, oil and gas are becoming more and more lucrative to 3 states in the upper Midwest. North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana have now set a record for oil and gas leases in the fiscal year of 2009. The Bureau of Land Management says that lease sales in those 3 states totaled more than $75 million this year, with most of that total coming from the western part of North Dakota. Those leases have been growing year after year. In fact, in 2008, that region saw another record, more than $51 million in sales. And to the far, far west, the northwest in fact, climate change is having a dramatic impact on Alaska's North Slope coastline. A new report says that impact will threaten both wildlife and oil production in the region. The new report from scientists at the University of Colorado says that North Slope erosion is happening at a rate of up to 45 feet a year. They say warmer ocean water is now thawing the base of frozen bluffs. That in turn destroys natural ice barriers that protect the coast and causes large chunks of earth to fall each and every summer. These scientists say they studied the coastline midway between Point Barrow and Prudhoe Bay. That's the site of the nation's biggest oil fields. The study says continuing erosion could ultimately be a problem for energy companies like ExxonMobil and BP, with major plays in that area. Well, on this Tuesday, we'll take a look at some of the events scheduled around the Washington, D.C. area today. This afternoon, 4 o'clock p.m. on the Energy Report, Andrew Light, Senior Fellow with the Center for American Progress, is joining us live. He'll discuss what he saw and what he learned during his 2 weeks in Copenhagen for the UN climate talks. Also, why he says getting only some major polluters on board with an agreement is good enough. That's at 4. And then shortly after that, 4:30 p.m. this afternoon, the American Petroleum Institute, based here in Washington, is releasing its weekly data report. That's again coming up at 4:30 this afternoon. And that is this Tuesday morning edition of the Energy Report. Thanks for joining us for the latest. And if you have any comments, suggestions, questions about our programming here on Clean Skies News, we'd like to hear from you. You can email our team here in the nation's capital anytime at at cleanskies.com. And also throughout your day, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter as well. For all of us here in the Energy News Center, we're glad you're with us. I'm Tyler Suiters, and you're watching Clean Skies News.